South Korea and the US have inked a new trade deal as demanded by the Trump administration from its friends and foes alike. With more on the trade deal and broader ties between Seoul and Washington up next. Hope your work week is off to a good start. It's Monday, August 4th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. The recently sealed trade deal between South Korea and the US is poised to go into effect starting Thursday this week, that is August 7th. That being said, on Press Perspective today, we revisit the trade deal and its broader implications on the bilateral alliance and more. For this, I have Celio Fioretti with French daily Le Croix here in the studio. Celio, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
I also have research fellow Peter Lee at the Asan Institute of Policy Studies with the pundit take on the day's discussion. Peter, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
Right, Celio, we will start with you. So last week, South Korea and the US signed their deal on tariffs and trade. Let's start by walking through the details of that particular deal.
Yes, so last week trade agreement between South Korea and the US is quite a big one, both symbolically and economically, just right before the deadline that was imposed by the US. Under the deal, President Trump announced a 15% tariff on imports from South Korea, down from the 25% or even 50% for certain goods. It's notably lower than threatened. It's a deal similar to what Japan managed to negotiate a few weeks before, in some ways also similar to what the EU negotiated also just a few days before. In return of this downscale of the tariff, South Korea is committed to a massive $350 billion investment in the US, covering key sectors like semiconductors, shipbuilding, that was a main part of the negotiation, nuclear energy and biotech. And also, South Korea will have to buy for around $150 billion worth of energy from the US, mainly gas, liquefied natural gas. And that the whole funding and the investment, the $350 billion, is not clear yet how it will be done. That will be negotiated further during the summer to have more details on exactly where the money will go. But the most important part of this deal is the auto tariff. That was the big scare for South Korea. They were cut also to 15%. South Korea agreed to open its market to American car makers, but negotiation will also have to be more done further away to see on the safety regulation. That's a big part of the deal, because safety regulation in Korea and US are different, so they will have to adapt to find a way that works for both countries. Another part of the deal is the agriculture. South Korea managed to negotiate to not open more its market to American agricultural product. That was a big worry for South Korean, both consumer but also the farmers here that want to keep their products safe, because we remember 2008 there was a big protest for the US beef. So South Korea really wanted to avoid that situation again. So far it's done. It's managed to get it out of the deal. So yeah, it's left a lot of things unresolved, more of the detail, but in the grand scheme of things, it's all done, and it's quite a good news for South Korea.
Right. And now, Peter, speaking within your capacity as a researcher, what aspects of this particular deal would you choose to applaud, and what aspects leave you feeling slightly apprehensive about the future?
So I think Celia really just covered all the really big issues. I'd probably only add 2 points. So for me, the really positive point was that they kept the security and the trade components of this negotiation separate. And so what we ended up with last week was really a trade deal. It wasn't what, if we rewind back to April, where President Trump was talking about one-stop shopping and sort of a comprehensive package. We've managed to keep these two issues separate. And I think that's really important, and we're going to have a chat about that today. I think the second part, though, is they really made shipbuilding, the centerpiece of this deal, right? So if you think about the $350 billion investment, along with a $100 billion energy purchase contract, about a third of that, $150 billion is going to be devoted to shipbuilding cooperation, right? So I think that's a really important, significant point of difference between the Korea-US deal and what we've seen in other US deals with Japan or the EU and other countries. I think that's something that we're going to have to unpack. There's a lot of potential, but going back to what I'm apprehensive about potentially, we don't know the details yet. And so with this $150 billion shipbuilding package, as well as the overall $450 billion that has been sort of flagged, we don't know how this is going to be implemented or carried out. So we're still waiting, I think, on those details. And that goes to, I guess, President Trump, he's said quite a few things about this deal, but how do we know that he's going to abide by this? This is the second version of a deal that he has done with South Korea. So we have to remember that in 2018, he renegotiated the Korea-US FTA. And so he had a deal first time round, and this time he has basically asked for a new deal. So we have to really keep an eye on that. And I think the second point of that is, implementing that deal, the interpretation on the South Korean side has been quite different to what the US has been sort of saying. So we have to work out, where the real sort of truth is going to lie on this deal.
Right, for sure, Peter. Quite a number of pundits have been saying that the devil is in the details, of course. In the meantime, Celio, this trade deal between the US and South Korea has been covered by the foreign media. What has been the reaction to the deal beyond borders?
Well, I think the reaction to this recent South Korea-US deal has been quite largely positive, and we see in the US even Trump congratulated himself for the deal and even invited President Lee Jae-myung to come to the White House in the coming weeks. So that will be also a big event in the Lee Jae-myung presidential term. Himself, Lee Jae-myung called it a success. It was really a significant event of his first few months. It could have really damaged severely his reputation if he didn't manage to land a deal. He also commented that he was really happy, really removing uncertainty for Korean industry, that will now know where to go for the next years, once also, as we mentioned, the details will be settled in further negotiation. The Bank of Korea echoed that sentiment, noting that 15% tariff is manageable compared to 25% or 50%, and it's comparable to global standards nowadays with the EU, with Japan. So the Bank of Korea said they will keep a close eye on how it affects trade relations with other key partners, especially like China, which is still a major partner for Korea. Economists in Korea, meanwhile, see the first draft as a quiet win for South Korea. The $350 billion investment is a triumph for Washington, but also, as we mentioned, with the shipbuilding, also promise some good return on investment from Korea, expanding its broad infrastructure everywhere in the world and its expertise in shipbuilding. Samsung CFO, also Samsung company, welcomed the clarity of the deal that brings what the deal brings, and note they're still watching how details will unfold. I think the situation now for both domestic companies, but also foreign observers, to see what will be done in the details. The devil lies in the details, as you said. But still, Koreans are quite confident in their possibilities of achieving a really good deal in the next few months.
Right, for sure. I mean, Trade Minister Kim Jong-kwan, like you mentioned earlier, also reiterated President Lee Jae-myung's remarks that the deal essentially eased uncertainties about trade for exporters here. Peter, I'd like to touch upon something you mentioned earlier. There's conflicting remarks by South Korea and the US with regard to this trade deal. There is a soundbite from the White House that I'd like you to listen to with regard to the potential import of American rice by South Korea, according to the White House, of course. To take a listen, please.
And South Korea will pay a 15% tariff rate, including 15% on autos, while providing historic market access to American goods like autos and rice. Korea will purchase $100 billion in American energy by 2028. And the centerpiece of this deal is that South Korea has agreed to invest $350 billion at the president's direction to revitalize American industry.
Right, now the investment we already covered. I'd like to take your attention to the talk about rice. Peter, officials here in the country, to be clear, have said there is no change with regard to the import of American rice and beef, as Celio mentioned earlier. What are your thoughts with regard to the remarks by the White House, though?
So I think it reflects the fact that expanding US access to Korea's agricultural market has been a key priority of the Trump administration in their first time around and again in their second time. And it reflects the fact that, for instance, the Korean beef market is the largest export market for American exporters, right? And so if we look at rice as well, of the Korea's import quota system, the United States occupies about 30% of that system, compared to other countries that are major rice exporters such as Australia, China, Vietnam, and Thailand. So if you take those two areas where Press Secretary Leavitt was talking about, right, rice and beef, it reflects the desire, I think, to keep pushing that agenda on the part of the Trump administration. And so even if you go back to the first trade deal that they did in 2018, that also included some provisions around trying to expand that market access. I think there's Korean sensitivities, obviously, in terms of keeping the market open, but also, political sensitivities, domestic constituents that need to be addressed as well. So I think the South Korean government will have to tread very carefully on these two areas, at least in the agricultural sector.
Right, and staying with the within the agricultural arena, Celio, as you mentioned earlier, Korean farmers, they've not hidden their intentions to respond strongly to any potential South Korean concession to the Trump administration with regard to rice and, of course, beef. Could you tell us a bit more?
Indeed, rice and beef is really always has been an emotional flashpoint for South Korea. And this time is no different. Across the countries, farmers have been on edge during the whole negotiation and are still very much on edge, worrying that a greater access for U.S. Agricultural products could put their livelihood at risk. We remember, as I mentioned, in 2008, the massive protest against the U.S. beef in Korea. And for many people in the countryside and farmers, this moment feels like the biggest threat, again, to their economy. What's driving the anxiety is a fear that South Korea is trying to secure favorable terms with the U.S. in a deal. And with this attitude of the U.S. pushing more and keep talking about this U.S. agricultural product wanting to be exported in Korea, it feels for some farmers that at some point they will have to be sacrificed for the sake of the Korean economy in a bigger scale, and they don't want to kill their business. South Korea has a small, reduced amount of land compared to the U.S., so it's harder to compete with a mass production of U.S. products. And these farmers, they really are raising their voice to make the Korean government remember that they should not be sacrificed for a better deal. So far, as we mentioned, the current deal is excluding U.S. products going into Korea, but we don't know if that will be the line forever. Donald Trump said he will probably negotiate more, and that's we saw also with Leavitt, the press secretary. So there's still some ambiguity, and I think the farmers are really on the edge about that. We'll see how the negotiation goes for the next few months, maybe even few years. But the U.S. doesn't seem to forget about this. They really want to push something to make a new deal for U.S. products. We'll see how Korea can respond to this.
Right, and there is some talk about this particular issue maybe taking place during the summit between President Lee Jae-myung and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump, which is expected to take place this month, of course. Now, Peter, as you mentioned earlier, security was not included in this trade deal. Do you suppose that particular topic of defense cost sharing might actually emerge during talks between President Lee Jae-myung and Donald Trump?
So I think it's going to have to be a big part of the upcoming summit, but I also think that we need to sort of be a bit cautious about overestimating or getting over enthusiastic about the security outcomes. There's only going to be a very short time period between the deal and the summit. I think President Trump during the election last year, he was talking about cost sharing, raising that to $10 billion a year, right? So tenfold. It's open whether he still remembers those big outlandish bids, but I think we need to have a discussion between the Korean and US defense sides. So until now, we've mostly had these discussions around the trade and economic sides. I think the defense cost-sharing issue needs to be led primarily by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, by Minister of Defense Ang Kyu-baek. This is a defense and alliance issue. This is not an issue that should be dealt with as a trade and negotiation strategy. So I think it's been really good that the trade deal was kept separate from the security issues. I think the upcoming summit, though, it's going to have to broach some of these issues around alliance burden sharing, the appropriate cost sharing. Last year, the outgoing Biden administration, they secured a 5-year deal to increase cost sharing around about $1 billion a year. So there's clearly going to be demands from the US side to increase that, but also to increase Korean defense spending. I think there's an ongoing debate around modernizing the alliance for other contingencies, for getting US forces ready for other issues, but also even some of the trade deal components that we can go back to, right? So Korean investment, how is that going to help the US defense industrial base? How is Korean investment going to help US shipbuilding, especially on naval shipbuilding for joint allied operations? So there are a huge range of issues that I don't think we're going to expect all of them to be resolved in the upcoming summit. I think they will put out sort of feelers around how they want to be continuing these negotiations led by their defense ministries. But I think that's where the cost-sharing debate needs to be seen within a broader context of other alliance issues that are on the table right now.
Right. And speaking about Defense Minister An Gyu-baek and his US counterpart, Pete Hegseth, that Peter just mentioned, they spoke on the phone last week, Celio. Could you tell us a bit about what was discussed and the broader implications of that discussion?
Indeed, the recent phone call between An Gyu-baek and Pete Hegseth is more than just a routine diplomatic check. It's a signal that the two countries are preparing to maybe reset the terms of the security alliance in light of evolving global dynamics. It's clear, and the US had really made it clear, that they want to modernize the alliance with South Korea. And under this term of modernizing the alliance, it's representative of a will from the US to have a new approach, what's called a strategic flexibility, to maybe use the US troops stationed in South Korea, not only in South Korea, but to move a bit more in Asia and to cover multiple fronts in case of a danger or threat in the China Sea or anywhere in the Pacific. And that will also be maybe linked with an increase of spending, 5% of GDP with NATO guidelines. He pushed for it in Europe before, and it might well also be now for South Korea. South Korea currently is spending 2.3% of the GDP on defense. And this call also touched on the long-running issue of transferring the wartime operational control, OPCON, as the military says, from the US to South Korea. And the current administration has been sending some confusing message, saying they want to finish this transfer by the end of the term, but then they backpedal, saying it's not the priority. I think they want to see how the US will react to this proposition to transfer the command. It has been in talk for almost a decade now, but it's also maybe now the time, because both countries are looking to modernize the alliance, to talk about this further. So overall, I think we're entering a new phase in the alliance between US and Korea that will shift, and I think the Lee Jae-myung administration wants to shift some things with the alliance. So we'll see a lot of movement on that. And still, there will have to be this cost issue to be resolved at some point. It's an issue that is very important for the US, also for Korea, because it will severely impact the economy. But they will have to negotiate that probably during the summit in a few weeks.
Right, the summit this particular month, of course. Now, this term, modernizing the alliance, Peter, some strongly believe that means shrinking the size of US troop presence here on the Korean Peninsula. That being said, what are the potential consequences, you suppose, of a shrink in size of US forces based here on the peninsula?
So I think recent history would say if done hastily and abruptly, like in the case of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, it can have devastating consequences for Allied trust in the United States, for the credibility of U.S. commitments. But I think it's part of a wider debate that's happening within the Trump administration at the moment. And for instance, they're undertaking a global posture review to look at how to right-size the 200,000 U.S. troops that are stationed abroad. And of that, 28,500 are stationed here in Korea. So I think for the Trump administration, there are some voices that say, is having 28,000 troops here on the Korean Peninsula, is that optimal for U.S. strategy in the global context as well as in the Indo-Pacific context? I think that sort of troop debate, there are growing calls to then take some, especially ground forces, out of the Korean Peninsula. And so that's a debate that's going to keep intensifying around, where they should be optimally placed to deal with the China contingency, right? And that's something that the Korea-US alliance has not really had to deal with for quite a long time. And since the Korean War, most of the focus has been on North Korea and deterring North Korean conventional attack against South Korea. Increasingly, we know the US is dealing in a region where Taiwan contingencies, South China Sea contingencies, and other contingencies around the world, are pulling on US demands. So, the US are going to keep having this debate. I think the South Korean side needs to be pushing forward about why having these forces here, or an optimally and mutually agreed outcome or number should be developed. So I think it's part of a wider debate, not a sort of hasty withdrawal, in the case of Afghanistan, that we don't want to see happen here.
Right, of course not, right, for sure. Well, with regard to those concerns about a potential troop reduction here, Foreign Minister Cho Hyun, speaking to the Washington Post, claimed that he believed there would be no change in the size of U.S. forces based on the Korean Peninsula. He also met with his U.S. counterpart, Marco Rubio, last week over in Washington, D.C. Could you tell us a bit about their talks and your takeaways?
Yeah, indeed. The meeting really underscored the depth and urgency of the challenges the allies are facing when it comes to North Korea. And both Cho and Rubio reaffirmed that the shared goal is the complete denuclearization of North Korea. And importantly, they stressed their commitment to upholding international sanction, particularly as Pyongyang is deepening its military alliance with Moscow. The growing alliance between North Korea and Russia is definitely raising alarm both in Washington and in Seoul. North Korea's shipment of weapons, artillery, shells, and even troops to support Russia's war in Ukraine is worrying, and it's more than just economic lifeline. They're really building a strong alliance with maybe transfer of technologies between Russia and North Korea, and probably they will increase the threat of North Korea in improving their nuclear arsenal. So that's very worrying. But the question is, how can both countries, South Korea and the US, can curb this threat and maybe interfere in this relation? Because the problem is that South Korea and the US wants to push on international sanction, but these two countries are already not respecting international sanction, and they're acting in a sort of separate world from the rest of the community, abiding by their own rules, and it's going to be really hard to abide sanction there. Also, the big changement now is that because of this alliance, North Korea feels they won't do any compromise on nuclear arsenal. They've been worried by the attack in Iran, saying that seeing that Iran was willing to make a compromise and still get attacked by the US. So now in the North Korea, they think they will have no incentive to make any deal with Trump if he wants to come back to the table. So South Korea and US are sticking to a denuclearization policy. It's good, but is it really effective to negotiate with North Korea? That remains to be seen. We've seen earlier this month that Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, said they will not talk with the South on any basis possible. So it seems hard to see if there will be any effect of this new policy or continuing of this policy with US and South Korea.
Right, for sure. It continues to be quite a bit of a dilemma here in the country, and I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. But that's a topic we'll actually be discussing later this week. Celio, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Pete, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.